So you're brilliant at hitting your goals, but how often do you take a step back and look at those results and think about what they're actually doing for you or for your company? On today's episode of Innovators Inside, we sit down with Dr. Sharon Spano. She holds a PhD in organizational and human systems and works with high impact founders and executives to move beyond the achievement stage. You know, that relentless grind for metrics and titles and exits. She's going to help us find our way into a deeper, more meaningful, and sustainable way of leadership. We're going to look at the emptiness of success and how unresolved trauma can find its way into boardrooms and product meetings. And we're going to look at how your ability to innovate is directly tied to your capacity for self-awareness, not just the hustle. So if you're a leader building what's next and something just isn't lining up, whether that's in your company or your life, then this conversation can offer you a roadmap toward growth. Welcome to Innovators Inside. Let's dive in.
Sharon, it's really good to see you this afternoon. How are you?
I am great. Thank you so much for having me on board today.
Thanks for coming onto the pod. It is a Monday afternoon in July as we record this. I think many of our listeners will have some time distance from this recording, but it's the height of summer, and so I appreciate you taking a little time.
Well, I am glad to be here.
And we had a chance to catch up a little while ago. I'm really actually looking forward to this conversation. We got a chance to get to know each other outside of the context of a podcast, and there's so much ground to cover, so much about leadership, so much about carrying sort of our human selves into the workplace and vice versa. We're going to get into it. For folks who don't know her, Dr. Sharon Spano helps high impact leaders break through what's holding them back to become better leaders, not just for themselves, not just for their businesses, but for their families and those around them. Sharon, thanks for coming on Innovators Inside. I would love to ask you to start maybe by introducing a little bit of your background. You've got your PhD in human and organizational systems. How did your work lead to where you're sitting today and the type of work that you're doing today?
Well, it's a long journey, and I won't go into all of it, but I started out actually doing advocacy work because I had a son that was born with a disability. And that kind of spearheaded into speaking engagements and consulting work and all these other things that I really didn't plan for. I had no idea that I was going to even have talent and skills in some of those areas. And as I got deeper into the consulting work, one of the things that I noted, and I always tell the story that literally often by 10 o'clock in the morning, I'd have 2 or 3 people crying at the front of the room about something that was going on in their department. And it was usually around a boss that, they were challenged by. I heard horrendous stories of leadership that were very concerning to me. And then from that, I really got more and more interested in leadership development and started doing strategic planning, leadership development, and things of that nature all across North America and in most of the major, Fortune 500 companies. And then one thing just kind of led to another, because the deeper I got into working with the groups, which I loved, I also saw that there was quite a bit behind each individual, that particularly the high achievers at the highest level, at the C-suite level, those guys, those women were carrying a lot. And the work now has morphed into more and more about human development, consciousness. I've got a lot of training in trauma. And one of the things that has surprised me, Ian, is to see how many high achievers have some level of trauma in their background that has really catapulted them to achieve. But then they hit a wall sometimes, and then we have to, dig a little deeper and resolve some issues. And, trauma can be anything from capital T to lowercase t, as I always say. Sometimes it's something as normal as my parents divorced when I was 4 years old. And sometimes it's bigger things like, my father died when I was a kid or whatever. But we find when we can do that deeper work, then they're even more fully positioned to be successful beyond what they've been in the past. And so that's kind of the short version, but it's been an evolutionary process for me. And I've had many certifications, a lot of training, a lot of education. I've never been an academic. I've always been out in the field, and I've learned so much from the people that I work with that it's just been a privilege. to serve
Well,
in
and
this.
it's thank you. Thanks for that background. And part of the reason I'm so excited for this conversation is I think, we're on a podcast where we talk about innovation and we talk about the ingredients for innovation and the stories and the outcomes and all of the things around it. And I do think that one of those underappreciated ingredients to successful innovation is, of course, the leadership that people take, right? How people show up as leaders trying to do something new, something iterative. And that's a hard thing to do, right?
Mhm.
It's a hard thing to carry. It's a hard burden for a leader. And so I'm looking forward to this conversation. I have one more question. You spend a lot of time talking about the emptiness of success experienced by high achievers. Can you share a little bit more about that? Because I think so many of us, will look at accomplished business executives, political, leaders, artists, whatever
Mhm.
they are. And, our first thought is like, wow, life must be perfect.
Yeah, well, let me put it in the context of human development, which is where I live, and I'll try to keep this succinct because it's very complicated. But what we know is there are 12 stages of human development based on the research that's out there today. And so most people in the American workforce, I think the latest stat is somewhere like 62, maybe 65%, they fall at either level 5 or 6. And
Okay.
6 is what we, call the achiever stage. That's where a lot of entrepreneurs live. And so at that achiever stage, there's nothing wrong. Not one stage is not better than the other. They're just different perspectives on how to do life. At the achiever stage, we're typically, we're in the grind. We're chasing time, we're chasing money, we've got goals, and everything is about goal orientation. So when the high achiever achieves all of those things that he or she has been after for most of their career, now I've got the cars, the house, the 2.5 kids, all the accolades, the business is growing, or I've got the position I've always dreamed of. Then it's not uncommon for people to kind of hit a wall and ask the harder existential questions. Is this all there is? Because I'm here now what?
Yeah.
How many more cars can I buy? How many, whatever. And so, what I really like people to understand is that is an opportunity to grow and develop to a later stage. It's really nature telling you now are longing for some other, more different, perhaps even more profound level of fulfillment. The concrete measures of success are no longer fulfilling to you in the same way. Doesn't mean we still don't want those things. I just bought a brand new car and I love the darn thing. I still want those things, but I want other things as well. Gratification looks different as I get into the later stages. And so rather than feel, back in the day, we used to call it like a middle age crisis, that empty
Sure.
feeling. That's often when people start deciding they want to live somewhere else, or they want to quit their job, or they want a divorce, or the old cliche, having affairs and whatever. But really, it's the consciousness, the body, the mind, the spirit saying, this is time for me to grow up and into something bigger than where I've been before.
So how do we do that? I mean, how do we balance this sort of like ambition and goal setting that has driven so many of us with a concept of maybe a different concept of fulfillment?
Well, I
I mean,
think,
I'm sure there's no simple question. I'm just going to throw the big
yeah.
one at you here for simple
Yeah, well,
answer.
I mean, it's what I do every day, because most of the people that come to me, are feeling that, like they know something's missing, or something that often use the word I'm stuck, or I'm unfulfilled,
Mhm.
something like that. And so we do the work. I mean, I have a process that helps them really start to witness themselves, because it's really about becoming awake and knowing yourself in a completely different way. So we go through a process that allows them to really start to see themselves and identify what it is that they want beyond where they are. And we always say in the developmental world, everything transcends and includes. So it's not like we're cutting off what came before. We're just adding to it. We're advancing it to another level, if that makes sense.
Well, it does. I have to imagine though, and I really want to kind of dive into this for a second. I have to imagine that that's not a short process, right? To get people to really reflect and maybe take a different perspective on what they want or what they want next. Is this your potential Unleashed program? Is that how you operate this?
Yeah, that's one of the offerings that I have for my one-to-one clients. It's a 12-week intensive, and it's really a hybrid of all my training and all the years that I've worked in the field. And we do find I used to do it as a 6 month, but with people
Oh,
being so inundated with so much today, I find that they were losing momentum. It's better if we meet every week. And so we've managed to turn it into a 12-week intensive that most people can really gain a lot of ground in the 12 weeks. Sometimes I'll have clients that want to do another round. I've had clients that'll stay a year, and do more than one round. But the work is designed and it's all customized. I have a structure for it, but it's customized in a way that I can quickly move people through to at least another level of understanding. And then they may go off for a while, as some do, and then now they need to come back down the road as things settle or whatever, because this is a lifelong journey that we're living, right?
yeah.
We should always be conscious, in my mind, of how to grow into that next place in life, whatever it's going to be for you. Because I mean, we only have one life, so why not live it to the fullest extent possible? I think when we stop growing is when people really, depression, anxiety, a lot of the other things that I also see come into play, because people just start giving up. But if you stay curious and you stay conscious and you're focused on, growing, it's a pretty exciting journey, and there's no end to it until the end.
Well, and for those of us without the kind of foundational background in sort of psychology, but also and human development here, it's is this a necessarily linear journey through these stages, or do people go back and forth? Like, I have to imagine that some people are going to come out of an intensive period of work with you really energized, really convicted around what they want, what their goals
Mhm.
are. But I could so easily see people backsliding, right? For it, unable to achieve, something changes in their family life. Who knows? Am I thinking
Right.
about this properly?
Well, you are to some extent, in that when we expand consciousness, I mean, you expand it. You have now a different perspective. I always use, with the respect to the stages, I like to use the analogy of a mountain. As a baby, I'm in my crib. All I know is I live on Main Street in my crib, and I can see my fist. But, if you start climbing that mountain of consciousness, and now I'm up at the top of Mount Mitchell, which is where I'm here in North Carolina, I can see 4 states. I have a broader expansion.
Sure.
But yeah, I'm not going to stay on that mountaintop all the time. So we often talk about it as the center of gravity. So I might be, for instance, at the achiever stage for many, many, many years, or forever. That's fine, as long as my life is robust at that stage. But then if I do the work and I move to another stage, I will stay there until another life event might happen, or some kind of stress. And then I might slip back down for a bit. But the difference is I'm not there very long, because I now know something bigger and better. So kind of the simple way I like to explain it, Ian, is if we think of the early stages, we all are familiar with those, because that's from birth to, like adolescent, the first four.
Yep.
um, I always say, a baby doesn't forget to crawl when he or she learns to walk. They just don't crawl as often. I still know how to crawl, even at my age. You know how to crawl. We just don't crawl because we know how to walk, right? So it's kind
And
of
and
this.
it makes my knees hurt.
And yeah, exactly. So it's kind of the same thing, is that
Yeah.
once my consciousness expands and I have a greater awareness of self and others and humanity, it's not just about my egocentric desires now. I now have a broader expansion of the world, and even the universe, as I get into the later stages. I'm going to be there until, I do have maybe a moment, but I can pull myself out much quicker because I have that awareness of how to do so.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think, this is one of those topics that at least for sort of how my mind works, it feels like you really have to kind of wallow in, right?
Mhm.
Like I understand the framework, and it feels so important to be able to advance to a next stage. But to really understand it, I think you probably have to do the work.
Right.
Um, but let me ask you one question. What are the negatives for a leader, or the potential negatives for a leader, of sort of moving to the next level, like moving beyond the achiever stage, for instance? Am I going to end up a little bit too content, a little bit too zen, and all of a sudden lose the drive that keeps me in the lifestyle I'm accustomed to, or the reputational,
Mhm.
context I'm accustomed to, et cetera?
That's a great question because there is that possibility. I prefer to think of it as a calmness. And
Yeah.
again, the integration is more prevalent when you get to the later stages where you feel the calmness. You're actually more focused. You're able to be more creative and more innovative. The downside could be that if I don't do the work in the earlier stages, and often psychologists refer to this as shadow work. So if I have unresolved trauma or any of the negatives of my earlier life that I have not addressed, we tend to bring that with us, and it's just almost personified more so at the later stages.
Mm.
um, it's kind of hard to explain because that's all unique to the individual, but that's why it's important to really explore why you are where you are, or why who you are, uh, as soon as you can in those earlier stages, so that when you advance you kind of have a clean slate to some degree. I mean, never entirely. I like to refer to it as my nerdiness. So I know that when I'm stressed out, I'm going to slide back down to this level of whatever Sharon Spano is when she's at her worst, but I have awareness of it such that I can see it literally in the moment, and again, pull myself out a lot quicker.
Yeah, it makes sense. My um gosh, I don't mean this to sound dismissive is not the word I'm looking for, but I don't mean to bring such a trivial example, but honestly, I know when I get off a long plane, for instance, I am not my best self. I have probably dropped a cognitive level. I've probably backslid a couple, and I beeline to McDonald's. And I know
Yeah,
that
yeah,
that's not the thing, and that's not me normally. But it's really interesting because, um, there is actually this kind of awareness that I am in a different state of mind than my
right,
general framing, and it feels like a backsliding imposed by outside stress or whatever.
right, right.
And I suppose that probably writ large can happen in all kinds of scenarios.
Yeah, yeah. And you bring up a point because it's the state of mind. But how it works for most of us, if you think about it, particularly in corporate environments, is, maybe we have a moment where we're not at our highest self in a meeting or whatever. Most of us walk out of that meeting and we go into guilt or shame or anger or whatever, and we feel
Yeah.
bad about it after the fact. When you learn to witness in the moment, which is a big part of what I teach my clients, then initially you start, they're reflecting on it after the fact, but we're not judging it. We're just noticing it to see what we can learn from whatever that behavior was. What I love about learning to witness is eventually you learn to correct in the moment, as I alluded to a few seconds ago, but then eventually you don't do those things anymore at all because you have such a heightened awareness that, like, why would I even go there? Like it doesn't even make sense for me to behave that way in a meeting because I've figured out how I mean, I can literally see myself and know this is how others are seeing me, and this makes no sense. We talk about it in terms of first, second, third, fourth person perspectives.
Yep.
Most of us are walking around with just a first person perspective until we're trained otherwise to literally put ourselves in the shoes of others and see, literally see them looking at us, which is an interesting ability and skill to acquire.
Suspend your attention and actually be able to intercept where you're going to go. So,
Right.
so now this is interesting. We've been talking about some really interesting topics of kind of like human development for the past 14, 15 minutes. Why does this matter for innovation, right? Why does this matter for the people who are listening to this podcast who want to drive change in their world? I promise you, a lot of them are very goal oriented,
Yeah.
right? I promise a bunch of them are entrepreneurs and a bunch of them are agitating inside their large organizations for change. Why does this awareness of both human development, but also how that ties to us as leaders, impact
Yeah, it's
our
so
work as
important.
innovators?
Yeah. Well, think about, I mean, there's two things that come to mind for me. One is, if I'm not aware, if I'm not self-aware, and I'm not doing what I need to do for my not only self-care, but just from my own expansion of consciousness, I'm not going to have those creative, innovative ideas. I'm going to get stuck in the
Yeah.
treadmill and, the day-to-day tasks. And, we all have so much to do and accomplish every day. I'm not going to have the ability to be innovative just in terms of how my own mind works. To me, that's the first thing. But then the second thing is, if I don't have that level of awareness, it would be so easy then. It is easy. And we see with all the stressors of today, for us to get myopic about my idea is the only idea that matters. And now I can't hear the ideas of my colleagues, or of others in a way that allows for us to collaboratively create something new, bigger, and better. So it works both, I think, internally as well as externally on my own behalf as well and on the behalf of others.
Let me test that a little, because I think that makes a lot of sense. But there's this concept that has been a little bit resurgent, I'd say, over the last year or so, of founder mode, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is really about the leader leading, not stepping back and managing
Right.
through consensus. How do you? I think I have an answer to this, but I think you've got the smart one. How do you reconcile this sort of like autocratic authority figure who is, through sheer force of will, building a company or changing the world, with this notion of not being myopic, not being dismissive of the talents and expertise of those around you?
Yeah, that's a great question as well, because I think, well, because I run into that a lot, because particularly, the founder syndrome is a real thing if it's an entrepreneur and he or she has built the company.
Yeah.
I mean, and they have a reason to have that ego and that belief because they've done the work from the ground up. But often what we have to do is look at the ego and where it's showing up and where it's serving them and where it may, be detrimental to them in terms of, the people that they're working with. And often, they'll bring to me, they might be having, for instance, an issue with a partner or a specific individual on their team, and they're looking at it from, again, a first person perspective. But when we dive into it, we may uncover other things that point to the fact that, maybe they are being myopic or too autocratic or whatever. That's what I love about leadership development, though, is you get to help. I feel like I'm just a crucible, or I'm holding up a mirror for the leader to see themselves. And there's no greater compliment. And I had one of my clients on Father's Day send me a Voxer and said, "I'm a better father because of your guidance."
That
And
is, as a father myself, like that actually almost makes me tear up.
it did me. It made my Father's Day, because that's why I say better leaders for themselves, their businesses, and their families, because I see so many leaders who are, just by default having to sacrifice their families to some degree in order to maintain the level of commitment that they need, for their businesses. And so I don't push that, but it almost always comes up where they're feeling disconnected from their children or their wives or whatever, or their husbands. And then we go down that path if we need to. And that's part of the whole life experience. It's being fulfilled in every area, not just one. And
Yeah.
I just love the potential to be able to do that. So I don't know if I'm answering your question about the founder syndrome. I'd love to hear your perspective, because you had a thought about that. Tell me what you're thinking.
No, it is really interesting, and I'm actually I'm noting the terminology that you're using as well on founder syndrome, versus the terminology that I was using on founder mode. And I don't know if that matters, but I think I think what you said makes sense, right? There is an enormous amount of inertia behind how
Mm-hmm.
people operate when they've built a company, when they have driven change in a large organization, whatever, because what has worked in the past will work in the future, right? Of course, of course it will, until it doesn't. But
Right.
and there is a little bit, I think, of a syndrome that I feel like, yes, I've seen around people constructing blinders around themselves
Mm-hmm.
because of what's worked in the past. But then there's this counterforce. And there's this counterforce that if you let go of your identity as a leader, and maybe the leader, and if you let go of the vision that you paint and your authority to set direction for an organization, the organization can stumble, right? And I think there's this concept in Silicon Valley that differentiates between the founders who have almost the moral authority to make hard decisions and the managers that maybe don't and maybe are reacting to different incentives. And the idea that that founder, that leader, uh, is in a better place if they're operating as a leader. They're not just reacting to those around them. And so it's interesting because where I was going with my thinking is that uh, the best founders that I've worked with, and to an extent, the best executives at Fortune 500 firms that I've worked with or for, have held on to their identity as strong leaders and people with the not just executive but moral authority to make hard decisions, but they have not forgotten to be curious and to
Mm-hmm.
integrate the knowledge of those around them. Right. I was at Microsoft during the early Satya years,
Mm-hmm.
where Satya Nadella came in and took the whole company into learning mode. He had all of the authority in the world, but he took the entire company and himself into deep learning mode. But
How
the
exciting.
interesting thing, what's that?
I said, how exciting that must have
It
been.
was exciting. It was exciting. But the thing that I reflect on that I find really interesting is he did that after he put one really clear stake in the ground. He gave a whole talk and he put a stake in the ground around how the cloud is the future of the company. He
Mm-hmm.
didn't define it. He didn't answer the questions of how we would get there, but he said that explicitly. He made a decision. Then he said, we're going to learn together. And for me, that's a really interesting balance of someone operating with something analogous to founder mode, even though he wasn't a founder of the company, and the concepts that you're talking about in terms of being able to listen, be compassionate, be curious, but also integrate ideas around you. I don't know if that was articulate, but
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
feel like there's two opposing forces that maybe are not, or two opposing concepts that maybe are not actually all that opposing here.
I think, yeah, I love what you've shared, because what you're bringing to mind to me, and what I think I've seen as well, I think there's a distinction between corporate, the traditional corporate stuff as we've seen it through the years, and then as tech evolved, because tech is innovation. And so it
Yeah,
feels to
often.
me like the leaders have had to be a, a different kind of leader. They're not doing business in the way that business used to be done. And then we saw an extension of that, I think, when all these platforms popped up years ago, where people just had ideas and they'd start a company, throw the spaghetti up against the wall with angel investment money, and hope it worked. And if it didn't, they'd close it down. And I was interviewing a lot of CEOs that were doing that at that time. They'd
Yep.
never been a CEO before. They hadn't climbed the ladder. They hadn't had the training and development to be a CEO. So, I mean, I think leadership, we only have 100 plus years, I think, of leadership research. We still don't really even know what it is. It's always evolving. But I think the
Mm.
tech space has taken it to another level, because the nature of tech is innovation, and
Yeah.
leaders need to be innovative. And that's what I love about your show, that you're talking about something that is so relevant in these. I mean, this is such an evolutionary time, with the onset of AI at a whole new level. There's just so much happening so fast that
That's key. Like
Yeah.
I wonder I wonder how much of this is, you talk about tech being innovation. I think that's true, but I also wonder how much of it is that it's a faster loop of iteration and innovation than
Mhm.
traditional industries being driven by tech. And we're all getting carried along there,
Yeah.
right? Like all companies need to evolve or die. All
Yeah.
organizations need to evolve or die. That's
Right.
just kind of like classic, right? I think
Yeah.
leaders have struggled with this for ages, but it may have played out for decades.
Yeah.
And now leaders have to think about adapting in years or months or weeks or days or
Yeah.
minutes.
I'm
And I feel like
watching
that
right.
adds.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Oh no, please go ahead.
Well, I'm watching reruns and desperation. I'm watching reruns of Mad Men,
Oh yeah,
and it's I had seen it a million years ago whenever it first came out, but it is absolutely shocking how archaic their systems are, or lack thereof of
yeah.
systems. And I mean, literally, their graphics are being drawn by hand, and it's just almost laughable, and yet that wasn't all that long ago. And so when you think about where we've come and what's happening in terms of just how leaders have to be aware of so many multiple systems in order to just make it all work, and the level and the hierarchy, or maybe not a hierarchy, because some organizations don't operate on a hierarchy of people involved, just to keep the game going. To me, it's just so exciting. I mean, I just can't imagine a better time to be in business than right now.
I will say, while I agree with you, I miss the concept of a 3 martini lunch. Not not
Yeah,
just because of the
yeah,
martinis, although who likes a
yeah,
martini, but the
yeah.
time. I can't imagine. I've never in my career been in a professional environment where even the concept of having the time to do that existed. And
Yeah,
I
it's
do think that's
it's
kind of
shocking.
interesting.
It's so shocking what was the norm. I had a lunch meeting today with a friend of mine that, excuse me, she's from Connecticut, and she said, "Oh no, we were talking about this very thing," and she said she used to ride the train. She remembers growing up in the neighborhoods where these admin lived, and she said, "No, it really was like that," because I thought some of this has to be fictionalized, because I never remember, there being so much liquor. I mean, I worked in downtown LA when I was young in corporate, but I worked in law firms, so liquor was
Yeah.
not a thing. Cocaine, there was a period where there was that going on, but it's just I think my point being, what was the norm then now is shocking, and 50 years from now, what's the norm now will be shocking. Like, people will look back and say, "Oh, you guys didn't have a clue what you were doing. We're all robots now." Who knows? But these are definitely interesting times, and for leaders particularly, they got to stay on top of it and do their best to be as whole as they can within themselves to handle the external stressors, for sure.
Well, it makes it does make sense, and I think it's ever more important to have that sort of self-awareness as the world gets faster around us. And so to that end, do you have any strategies that you recommend for leaders to maybe let's kind of look at that internal trauma, whether lowercase t or capital T, to recognize what's going on inside themselves and uh impact or adapt how that changes, how that impacts the organization.
I think, one of the things that I always like people to consider is if you're hitting a wall for any reason. So, like, I'll give an example of a client I was working with that was having trouble with anger.
Mm,
And he thought it was specific to one person in his company. Well, when we did the deeper work, the anger was actually attached to a level of embarrassment that he had experienced as a child due to some trauma in those early years. And so then we did the work around that so that he had a handle on, when I get triggered with anger, it's really about embarrassment. Who's embarrassing me? Why? What can I do about it? How can I make healthier choices? So again, it always goes back to the level of awareness. But then I also think that there's opportunities for us to be looking at, just on a regular basis. When we talk about human development, we talk about lines of development. That's how we move to the other stages. And
yeah.
there's many. Cognitively, most of your high achievers, they're doing that all the time. But then what can I be doing for myself emotionally, interpersonally, somatically, physically, the other lines that I should be developing along the way, not just my brain. I find many leaders that I work with have a hard time connecting to their heart, to the somatic experience in their own bodies. So they don't have the awareness of, when my body is triggered or stressed out. They just don't have that. So we work on those lines of development to help them, again, become more full in every area of their life.
And does this sort of automatically reflect into the organizations that they lead or they work in? Or is there sort of additional work or awareness they have to do there?
I think, to me, because we're whole beings. So when you're doing it at one level, so let's say I'm developing my somatic awareness. I'm literally working to understand, when I get angry, I can feel my heart racing, or I feel
Yep.
my whatever. I break into a little bit of a sweat, or I feel it in my gut when so and so speaks in a meeting. Once they start to understand that about themselves and experience those triggers, sometimes we'll say simple things, take a deep breath, start to try to imagine yourself relaxing, just some of those more common kinds of things, so that they have a level of self-awareness, but they also know what to do about it when they do notice these things. So yeah, then it flows over into their behavior in their work environments, because they are calmer. Often I have clients, if they're really stressed out or they're ADHD or something, we'll do practices around meditation, breath
Mhm.
work, things of that nature, just to help them connect to their body. In Western society, we're not connected to our bodies. We're just not. We're moving so fast and we're working out and we're doing those things, but we're not connected to the subtle energies of the body. And those are the energies that tell us so much and give us so much information about, what is going on and what is causing us to react in certain ways. So when you can tap into that, you again can make healthier choices.
Amazing. Well, this has been really interesting, Sharon. And I think we've given folks a lot to think about. One, I think I have one more question for you as
Okay.
we get toward wrapping up, and it's about hustle culture,
Mm.
right? Like we celebrate it. We
Yeah, we
celebrate
do.
the hustler. We celebrate the person who's constantly striving. I don't know that we celebrate the people who have successfully learned to listen to their body, to balance the forces,
Mhm.
to suspend attention and pay attention to what's going on around them. Um, what do you think? And is there something that we need to change as a society or maybe just a business community there?
Well, there's definitely something we need to change. I think the younger generations probably are going to be the ones that make those changes, because they've watched the rest of us burn out and fry our
Yeah.
brains to some degree. But they've got their own level of pressures. As I was listening to you, I'm thinking of Europe and Italy and Spain, and my husband's Italian. And when we go over there, the joke over there is the Italians don't live to work. They don't work to live. I'm totally mixing it up. They don't live to work.
To
They
work.
work
They
to
work to
live.
live.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they work to live, because they're going to do a 2 hour lunch and or a siesta, whatever they call it, or they're going to do a 3 hour dinner with family and friends. It's about life. It's not about work. And my point in that is, to what you said, is we don't celebrate people who do that, which is so ironic when you think about, we work very hard to do the things we want to do, which is go on vacation or travel or be with our family and friends, but then we don't do those things because we don't take the time for that. So it does need to change, but I think it's going to take a while for us as a society to accept it. And I think we are making some strides in the right direction, even with remote workforces. And I know that's controversial, but I think people have come to realize, I don't need to be spending 2 hours commuting. I can get more done in less time, and then have time for my family and recreation and other things. But we're a long way from it, as far as I can see, because what I am seeing is an increase in anxiety, depression, ADHD.
Yeah.
those kinds of things. And at some point, we're going to hit a tipping point where no one's going to be worth anything if we don't make those changes.
I do wonder when that tipping point is going to be and what it looks like. I mean, I think I'm sure there's stuff we're imposing on ourselves as people. The pace of change driven by new technological capabilities, I think, is something that humans just have never had to adapt to before in the same way.
Right.
So I do wonder like when the breaking point will be and what it'll look like. Because I got to tell you, it makes me a bit nervous. And I think and now I'm kind of stepping back to maybe more societal than professional context. It's kind of more all encompassing, but it makes me nervous.
Well, yeah, and I think rightfully so, because we're seeing what it's doing to our kids.
Yeah.
And so what I try to tell people is, because I see so much of it, is just on an individual level, even myself, shutting off that cell phone at a certain time, staying off of the computer after a certain time, because it's addictive and we all want to be on it, and we can very easily 24/7, making time to sit down and read something that is nourishing versus always about business, turning off the news. I'm just very, very conscious and intentional about what I watch, read, and listen to, and how much of it I allow in. And I think if each of us could do a better job of that and model it for our children, maybe we'll start moving in the right direction. We have to make the changes, though.
That's a wise words of advice there, and I appreciate it, Sharon. So I want to say thank you for joining us on Innovators Inside. This has been a really interesting conversation. I think has given folks a lot to think about that is maybe, adjacent to and intersectional with where they spend their days today thinking about innovation. I think it's incredibly important. For folks who want to stay connected to you and your work, or who maybe want to follow up on some of these ideas in a little more depth, where should they go? Should they go to LinkedIn? Should they go to your website?
Well, I'm all over all of it, as we all are, right? But my website is SharonSpano.com. And then we also will have a special page for this podcast on my website. And that is SharonSpano.com/alchemist. And within that page will not only be the podcast, but we have a quiz called the Leader's Edge that's free. Because always when I talk about the stages, people want to know, how can I advance to a later stage? Achievers particularly always want to know that. So it's a very complicated and expensive assessment. So what we did was we took the main 6 stages that we find in the workforce, and we made up a quiz that's pretty interesting and gives you a report, so you can see kind of where you fall in terms of what I call the center of gravity, where you are most of the time. And then there's some action steps there as well that will tell you some things, that you might want to consider, improving upon. And then if you need more information, you can always reach out to me through the website, or Sharon at SharonSpano.com.
Incredible. Well, Sharon, you'd better believe I'm going to be taking that quiz. We'll get it linked in the show notes. I really appreciate your investment of time and follow-up for this conversation today. And thanks for coming on Innovators Inside.
Thank you for having me. It was a lot of fun, and I appreciate your very provocative questions.
It was a ton of fun. Thanks for rolling with it. And have a wonderful rest of your week and your summer.
You as well.